What really set this whole situation in motion was a familiar problem many people quietly deal with: the abuse of power by homeowner associations. HOAs are supposed to exist to maintain shared spaces and keep neighborhoods functioning smoothly, but somewhere along the way, that responsibility often turns into entitlement. Decisions get made behind closed doors, convenience starts to outweigh fairness, and suddenly private property becomes someone else's dumping ground simply because it's easier. In this case, snow wasn't just snow, it was a symbol of how casually boundaries were crossed. No phone call, no notice, no permission. Just trucks unloading a problem they didn't want to deal with onto land that wasn't theirs. And that's the danger of unchecked authority: it becomes blind to the people it affects. When an HOA assumes compliance instead of earning cooperation, it stops being a community partner and starts acting like a ruler. That kind of mindset doesn't just create frustration, it guarantees conflict. Because when power is exercised without respect, eventually someone will push back, not out of spite, but out of necessity. And that moment is when control starts to crack. At the heart of this was something simple that shouldn't need defending, but somehow always does: private property rights. Owning property isn't just about paying taxes or mowing a lawn, it's about having control over what happens on your land. When snow was dumped there without permission, it wasn't a harmless shortcut, it was a clear message that my space was considered expendable. And that's where the line gets crossed. If someone can use your property for their convenience today, what stops them from doing it again tomorrow with something worse? Respect for boundaries is what keeps communities functional. Without it, ownership becomes meaningless, and fairness turns optional. I wasn't objecting to snow removal, I was objecting to the assumption that my consent didn't matter. Property rights exist precisely for moments like this, when convenience threatens to override respect. They protect the individual from being quietly steamrolled by collective authority. Once those rights are ignored, you're no longer dealing with a neighborly misunderstanding, you're dealing with entitlement. And entitlement only grows when it goes unchallenged. This wasn't about being difficult, it was about making it clear that my land is not a free extension of someone else's problem. What made the situation even more unsettling was how little there actually was to justify Calloway's sudden suspicion. The woman wasn't doing anything unusual, just jogging at a steady pace, minding her own business, the way dozens of people in that neighborhood did every single morning. Yet Calloway watched her as if every step she took confirmed some invisible threat. In truth, nothing about her behavior suggested a crime, but his mind started connecting dots that didn't exist. A parked Tesla in a driveway became a high-value target. A woman jogging became a potential suspect. And the simple act of not acknowledging a passing police car suddenly felt like a red flag to him. These weren't signs of wrongdoing, they were projections of his own bias, forming a story that had no foundation in reality. Instead of pausing to reconsider, he let that narrative grow, convincing himself he needed to step in, to question her, to confirm his unfounded intuition. And with every second that passed, his certainty increased, even though the truth remained painfully simple: there was no crime, no threat, no reason at all to stop her, only the weight of a prejudice he refused to recognize. So when it became clear that talking wasn't going to change anything, the response had to be different, but it still had to be smart. Not loud, not reckless, and definitely not illegal. This wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. If the HOA could treat my property like an extension of their street, then the solution had to reflect that same logic, flipped back on them. Everything that was done stayed within the rules, because the goal wasn't to create chaos, it was to expose it. Creative pushback works best when it mirrors the original behavior so precisely that it can't be denied. Suddenly, the inconvenience they were comfortable passing along became impossible to ignore when it landed at their doorstep. That's the power of lawful resistance, it forces accountability without raising your voice. There's something deeply uncomfortable about being treated the exact way you've been treating someone else, and that discomfort is often the first step toward understanding. No threats, no damage, no crossed legal lines, just a response that made the consequences visible. And once the problem was impossible to overlook, the conversation they refused to have finally began. What happened next was something Jennifer could never have prepared for. The police confirmed that the brake line sabotage wasn't random, it was tied to a rival gang looking to spark a violent confrontation. And now that Marcus had seen the culprit up close, he wasn't just a helpful witness, he was a problem that someone dangerous might try to silence. That realization hit Jennifer like ice. She had spent years fighting to keep her son safe from the struggles of life, but this was something far darker. The bikers, who had seemed intimidating at first, immediately shifted into protectors, insisting that Jennifer and Marcus stay with them at a secure safe house until the threat was handled. That night, when a chilling message appeared on Jennifer's phone, "We know who you are," any doubt vanished. Fear settled in her chest, but she wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes, the people you're taught to fear become the ones who refuse to let anything happen to you. What this situation ultimately taught me was how important it is to stand your ground, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or inconvenient. It's easy to convince yourself that letting things slide is the mature choice, that peace is worth a little personal sacrifice. But there's a difference between choosing peace and surrendering your boundaries. When authority pushes without resistance, it learns that pressure works. Standing your ground doesn't have to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's simply refusing to accept what you know is wrong. I didn't set out to make a point, I set out to protect what was mine. And once that line was clearly drawn, everything changed. Respect followed action, not requests. That moment reinforced something bigger than this single dispute: fairness only survives when people are willing to defend it. When you respond calmly, legally, and confidently, you send a message that entitlement has limits. You don't need to outshout power to challenge it, you just need to stop yielding to it. And when you do, you don't just solve one problem, you remind everyone watching that boundaries only disappear when no one stands up to protect them.